The year is 2011. Across the vast landscapes of Texas, a silent threat is taking shape. It's not a single spark that will ignite disaster, but a combination of extreme environmental factors, a severe drought, relentless heat, and powerful winds that together will create a firestorm unlike anything the state has ever seen. By the end of that year, nearly 31,500 individual fires would sweep across Texas, consuming more than 4 million acres of land and destroying almost 3,000 homes. 10 lives would be lost, including 4 brave firefighters who battled the flames. The epicenter of this catastrophe emerged in early September in Bastrop County, just east of Austin. Over Labor Day weekend, families were enjoying the final days of summer, unaware of the danger brewing in the parched woods surrounding them. On Sunday, September 4th, 3 separate fires ignited in the area. The cause was deceptively simple. The drought-brittle trees, already weakened by months without rain, were toppled by strong winds and crashed into power lines, sparking flames that quickly gained momentum. One resident, Tiffany Cox, would later recall noticing heavy traffic and a strange haze in the sky. By the time she had put away her groceries, a massive column of smoke loomed over her neighborhood, a warning of the inferno that was about to engulf her home. The 3 small fires merged rapidly, driven by wind gusts fueled by Tropical Storm Lee churning in the Gulf of Mexico. Within just 48 hours, the flames combined into what became known as the Bastrop County Complex Fire. This was not a slow-moving blaze. The firestorm advanced with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. Flames leapt over roads, fire breaks, and even rivers. While embers were carried miles ahead, igniting new pockets of fire, emergency personnel went door to door, urging residents to evacuate, but for many, escape came too late. Firefighters reported flame heights reaching 100 feet, and the intense heat ruptured asphalt and concrete foundations. Entire neighborhoods were turned to ash almost instantly, and the scale of destruction overwhelmed local and state resources. As the Bastrop fire raged, more than 180 additional fires erupted across Texas that same week. Fire crews from over 40 states poured in to assist, while National Guard aircraft dropped slurry in an attempt to slow the advance. Yet the conditions were extreme. Blistering heat, bone-dry forests, and relentless winds combined to make containment almost impossible. By the end of September, the Bastrop County Complex Fire had already burned 25,000 acres and destroyed over 500 homes. This single fire complex would eventually become the most destructive wildfire in Texas history, responsible for more than half of all homes lost in the entire 2011 season. For the people of Bastrop County, the smoke, the roaring flames, and the loss of their homes would mark the beginning of a disaster that would define the year. The devastation of the 2011 Texas wildfires wasn't caused by a single spark, but by a rare combination of environmental and climatic forces that left the state primed for disaster. The first of these forces was the historic drought that had gripped Texas for months. From October 2010 through September 2011, the state endured the driest 12-month period ever recorded. Rivers, lakes, and reservoirs dropped to record lows, and grasses, shrubs, and forests dried out to the point where they could ignite with the slightest friction. This wasn't just a dry summer, it was a fundamental reshaping of the land's ability to resist fire. Bastrop County, where the largest fires would erupt, had been in a state of exceptional drought, the highest severity level since May of that year. Layered on top of the drought was the relentless heat. The summer of 2011 was scorching, with July alone setting the record as the hottest month in Texas history. Temperatures routinely soared well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, evaporating any residual moisture from the soil and leaving vegetation brittle and primed to burn. The heat acted like a kiln, curing the grasslands and forests into kindling that could carry flames across miles in minutes. But the drought and heat alone were not enough to produce fires of the scale that would devastate Texas. A third, less visible factor played a decisive role: a powerful La Niña weather pattern in the Pacific Ocean. La Niña events occur when sea surface temperatures in the eastern Pacific drop below average, altering global weather systems. For Texas, this meant the jet stream was pushed northward, diverting rain-producing storms away from the state and ensuring the dry, hot conditions persisted. The La Niña that began in 2010 was particularly strong and unrelenting. effectively shutting off rainfall for much of the state and setting the stage for a wildfire season of historic proportions. When these forces combined, the results were catastrophic. Trees, grasses, and homes became fuel in a landscape already primed to burn. Winds from Tropical Storm Lee in early September provided the final push, fanning sparks into unstoppable infernos. In Bastrop County, what began as 3 small fires merged within 48 hours into the Bastrop County Complex Fire, fueled by months of drought, extreme heat, and wind. This perfect storm of natural and climatic conditions explains why the fires were not just destructive, they were historic, leaving scars on the land and the people that remain to this day. When the fires finally began to subside, the full scale of destruction across Texas was staggering. Nearly 4 million acres of land had been consumed by flames, leaving behind charred forests, burned neighborhoods, and communities grappling with loss. The economic toll was immense. Insured property damage alone exceeded $500 million, while the state's timber industry faced losses of more than $1.6 billion. Farmers and ranchers, already struggling under the drought, saw crops and livestock wiped out, pushing the total economic impact across East Texas to an estimated $3.4 billion. Bastrop County bore the brunt of the devastation. 96% of Bastrop State Park, a treasured area of loblolly pines, was destroyed. The park's unique lost pines ecosystem, an isolated stand of pine trees unlike any other in the state, was devastated, along with the habitat of the endangered Houston toad, which relied on the area for survival. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash, and roads were blocked by burned debris, making rescue and recovery efforts difficult. Rebuilding would be slow and painstaking. Volunteers and forestry specialists planted millions of pine seedlings in an attempt to restore the scorched landscape. Experts estimate it could take a generation or more for the lost pines to fully recover. Erosion became a significant issue as heavy rains washed away soil no longer anchored by vegetation, creating new environmental challenges for the communities and the land. The fires also prompted lasting changes in public policy and community planning. In Austin, new building codes were introduced to make homes in high-risk areas more resistant to wildfires, requiring fire-resistant roofing and reinforced windows. Across the state, recovery organizations were formed to help families rebuild and to strengthen local resilience for future fire seasons. The events of 2011 left an indelible mark on Texas, reshaping how the state prepares for, responds to, and understands the threat of wildfires. The 2011 Texas wildfires were more than a moment of destruction. They were a stark lesson in the power of nature and the fragility of human settlement in extreme conditions. The scale of devastation revealed how quickly a combination of drought, heat, and atmospheric patterns can turn a familiar landscape into a deadly hazard. Across the state, communities began to reevaluate their preparedness, realizing that even regions with a history of resilience are not immune to environmental extremes. Scientists and emergency managers studied the fires closely to understand what had gone wrong and how future disasters could be mitigated. Fire behavior models confirmed that the speed and intensity of the Bastrop County Complex Fire were largely driven by the unusually low moisture content of trees and grasslands, combined with wind patterns that carried embers miles ahead. These findings influenced how Texas approaches fire risk, emphasizing early detection, strategic vegetation management, and stricter building practices in fire-prone areas. Beyond the technical lessons, the fires left an enduring impact on the people of Texas. Families who lost homes or livelihoods faced years of rebuilding, while communities strengthened networks of support and disaster preparedness. Volunteers, nonprofit organizations, and local governments worked together to replant forests, restore wildlife habitats, and provide assistance to residents, demonstrating resilience in the face of overwhelming loss. The legacy of the 2011 wildfires continues to shape Texas today. It serves as a reminder that climate and weather extremes are capable of producing catastrophic consequences, and that preparation, awareness, and adaptation are essential. While the scars on the land are slowly healing, the memory of those fires remains vivid, a story of destruction, human courage, and the ongoing need to respect the power of the natural world. In the years following the end of the Second World War, Texas City was seen as a symbol of American prosperity and progress. Located along the Gulf Coast on Galveston Bay, it had quickly become an industrial powerhouse fueled by its growing network of chemical plants, oil refineries, and a busy deepwater port. The constant hum of machinery, the sight of smoke rising steadily from refinery stacks, and the clanging of steel against steel were all considered signs of economic promise. Families had moved there from across the country, drawn by good wages and steady work in a region that seemed destined to shape the nation's future. The port was central to this success, exporting materials that supported rebuilding efforts in Europe and supplying fuel to power post-war expansion across the United States. Every ship that docked in Texas City represented jobs, opportunity, and civic pride. Tied to the pier in mid-April was a French vessel named the SS Grand Camp. It had arrived to load a chemical that at the time was considered harmless and beneficial. This chemical was ammonium nitrate fertilizer, produced to help revive crops in war-torn countries overseas. Thousands of tons of it were being packed tightly into the ship's cargo holds, sealed in paper sacks stacked high in the dim and confined interior. The product had been widely used for agriculture and was transported regularly through the ports across the world. In Texas City, it was viewed simply as another export, ordinary, unthreatening, and profitable. There was no alarm and no sense of danger. Yet while the town moved through its normal morning routine, changes were already happening deep inside the cargo hold of the Grand Camp. Temperatures were rising, the chemical was beginning to react, and a chain of events had quietly begun, one that would soon transform an ordinary working port into the site of a national tragedy unlike anything the country had ever witnessed. By early morning, faint wisps of smoke began to rise from the cargo hold of the SS Grand Camp. Crew members attempted to control the smoldering chemical by closing the hatches and injecting steam into the hold, hoping to smother the heat. This was a common practice at the time for preventing fires, but ammonium nitrate did not behave like ordinary cargo. Instead of cooling the smoldering material, the steam accelerated the chemical reaction, causing internal pressure to rise. On the dock, longshoremen and port workers noticed the ship's metal sides beginning to bulge slightly, an unusual sign that something was building inside the sealed compartments. Despite the smoke, there was no immediate evacuation. Children were on their way to school. Office workers had just sat down at their desks. Many residents, curious about the smoke, walked toward the waterfront to get a better view. Some recalled hearing popping sounds coming from the ship's interior, a warning sign that went unrecognized. Moments later, at approximately 9 a.m, the chemical reached a critical temperature. The Grand Camp erupted in a catastrophic explosion, sending a massive fireball into the sky and shaking the ground with the force of a small wartime bomb. Witnesses miles away reported seeing windows shatter and debris falling from the sky. The blast instantly destroyed the ship, blasted a crater into the port, and hurled the anchor made of solid steel over a mile inland. Burning metal fragments rained across the industrial district, igniting oil storage tanks and chemical facilities near the shoreline. The wave of hot air scorched everything in its path, while a shock wave flattened buildings, warehouses, and railroad cars. Firefighters who had rushed to the scene were caught in the explosion, and nearly all of the city's firefighting equipment was destroyed in an instant. The blast was so powerful that residents in neighboring communities, including Galveston and Houston, felt the force and believed an earthquake or an enemy attack had occurred. At that moment, Texas City was transformed from a prosperous port community into a disaster zone. Fires broke out across the city, emergency communication lines were disabled, and thick smoke began to blanket the area as a second threat quietly developed nearby, another ship carrying the same volatile cargo. In the immediate aftermath of the Grand Camp explosion, Texas City was thrown into complete disarray. Communication systems were crippled, telephone lines were severed, and emergency coordination became nearly impossible. Fires raged across industrial plants along the waterfront, feeding on crude oil, chemicals, and debris ignited by flaming shrapnel. Thick black smoke rose into the sky, darkening the morning sun and making visibility difficult for rescue workers. Many of the city's firefighters had perished in the blast, leaving Texas City without its primary line of defense just as new fires began to take hold. The situation grew even more alarming when emergency responders realized that a second vessel, the SS High Flyer, was also carrying a large quantity of ammonium nitrate and was now on fire. Throughout the port, confusion turned into panic. Rail yards filled with fuel tankers started to detonate from the intense heat, causing chains of secondary explosions. Industrial facilities containing benzene and other dangerous chemicals began to erupt one after another, creating shockwaves that traveled through the air like rolling thunder. The force of the explosions shattered glass miles away and knocked people off their feet, even in surrounding towns. Roads leading into the city became clogged with vehicles as people tried to flee, while others rushed in searching for loved ones. The hospitals quickly became overwhelmed, and makeshift triage stations were set up in schools, churches, and parking lots. Medical personnel from nearby cities were called in, but even with reinforcements, there were not enough supplies or space to treat everyone in need. Meanwhile, the SS High Flyer continued to burn. Emergency crews attempted to cut it loose from the docks and tow it away to prevent another catastrophic blast. Hours passed as workers struggled against spreading fires, damaged equipment, and dangerous fumes. Despite their efforts, the fire on the second ship reached its critical point. Late into the night, the High Flyer exploded with nearly the same force as the Grand Camp, compounding the devastation. This second blast shattered any remaining infrastructure, ignited fresh fires across the city, and destroyed additional sections of the port. The two explosions together created one of the most destructive industrial disasters in American history, leaving much of Texas City unrecognizable as the sun set on a day of unimaginable destruction. By the morning after the second explosion, Texas City no longer resembled a functioning community. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to twisted metal, splintered wood, and scorched earth. The port district had vanished into a landscape of craters and smoldering debris. Fires still burned across oil refineries and chemical storage tanks, sending columns of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. The scale of destruction made navigation difficult, forcing rescue workers to climb over rubble and sift through wreckage by hand. Many roads were blocked by fallen structures, and the air was thick with toxic fumes from chemicals that continued to burn uncontrolled. Within hours, emergency aid began arriving from across the state of Texas and beyond. The American Red Cross established supply stations, providing food, clothing, and medical equipment to survivors. The United States military deployed personnel to assist with recovery efforts, bringing heavy machinery to clear debris and search for missing persons. Temporary morgues were constructed as the death toll rose steadily, with victims identified from personal items because official records had been destroyed. Families searched silently among the ruins, hoping to find any sign of their loved ones. Despite the massive response, there were not enough hospital beds, and many injured citizens had to be transported to cities such as Galveston and Houston for treatment. The disaster also triggered widespread environmental damage. Chemicals spilled into Galveston Bay, killing fish and disrupting the ecosystem. Burning oil flowed into waterways, creating floating slicks that caught fire and spread flames along the shoreline. Air quality was severely compromised, forcing residents to cover their faces with cloth to breathe. Livestock that survived the explosions began to suffer illness from contaminated water sources. In some areas, fires burned for nearly a week before finally being brought under control. Texas City became a scene of continuous emergency operations, with rescue, cleanup, and humanitarian efforts running simultaneously around the clock. As authorities began to assess the situation, it became clear that thousands of people had been left homeless. Entire blocks of houses had been flattened, and what remained was unsafe to inhabit. The loss of infrastructure meant that electricity, water, and sanitation systems were inoperable. The federal government declared the disaster one of the most severe in the nation's history, prompting a large-scale coordinated relief effort. Yet even as the fires were gradually extinguished, the people of Texas City were only beginning to comprehend the full extent of what had happened. The final challenge lay ahead, rebuilding lives, restoring the city, and seeking answers about how such a catastrophe had been allowed to occur. In the months that followed the Texas City disaster, investigators from federal and state agencies examined every detail of the explosions to determine the root cause. The use of ammonium nitrate as cargo was not new, but this catastrophe exposed the dangers of transporting it in bulk without proper safeguards. Reports confirmed that the chemical had been stored in paper sacks within a sealed cargo hold, creating ideal conditions for a rapid buildup of heat and pressure. The disaster prompted widespread scrutiny of industrial safety regulations and forced lawmakers to confront the lack of oversight in maritime shipping and chemical handling. What emerged from these investigations would permanently reshape emergency planning and industry standards across the United States. The human cost was staggering. Thousands were injured, and the official death toll climbed into the hundreds, though the true number was likely higher due to unidentifiable remains. Entire families were lost. The city faced a long and painful rebuilding process that would take years to complete. Donations poured in from across the country, and charitable organizations helped provide temporary housing and basic necessities. Texas City's citizens, many of whom had lost loved ones, homes, or livelihoods, came together in acts of resilience and determination. Despite overwhelming grief, they refused to abandon their community. Legal battles soon followed. Survivors and families of the deceased filed lawsuits against the United States government, arguing that the ammonium nitrate had been manufactured and shipped without adequate warning of its explosive potential. This led to a landmark Supreme Court case that ultimately ruled against the claimants, citing government immunity. Even though financial compensation was limited, the case brought national attention to the responsibilities of both government agencies and private industries in preventing such disasters. This attention spurred changes in federal law that required clearer labeling, improved packaging, and stricter regulation of hazardous materials. Over time, the Texas City disaster came to be known as one of the deadliest industrial accidents in American history. It served as a turning point for workplace safety, disaster response, and chemical regulation. Communities across the nation began implementing evacuation plans, emergency drills, and hazard awareness programs to prevent similar tragedies. Refineries and chemical plants upgraded their safety protocols, and the shipping industry adopted new standards for the storage and transportation of explosive materials. Though the city eventually rebuilt, the memory of that day remained etched into its identity. The legacy of the Texas City disaster was not one of destruction alone. It was also a story of transformation. Out of unimaginable loss came significant progress in public safety, emergency management, and industrial accountability. The disaster served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of complacency and the importance of preparedness. Texas City rebuilt stronger, and its story continues to stand as a powerful lesson of how a single event can change the course of a nation's history. In the early days of September 1900, the bustling coastal city of Galveston, Texas, was completely unaware of the devastation that was about to unfold. Known as the Wall Street of the Southwest, Galveston was one of the wealthiest and most important ports in the United States. The city's prime location on Galveston Island along the Gulf of Mexico had made it a hub of trade and commerce, and its population had grown rapidly, reaching nearly 38,000 by 1900. However, this prosperity came with a dangerous sense of complacency. The city had weathered numerous storms in the past, and the residents believed that they would easily survive any future storms. Even Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, famously wrote in an 1891 article that it would be impossible for a hurricane of significant strength to strike the island. But all of that changed on September 8, 1900, when the Great Galveston Hurricane made landfall. This storm, later known as the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, would go on to claim the lives of an estimated 8,000 people, with some reports suggesting that the number could be as high as 12,000. The city of Galveston was devastated, with nearly every building suffering damage and thousands of homes destroyed. In a matter of hours, the thriving city was reduced to ruins, and the lives of countless families were forever altered. The 1900 Galveston hurricane wasn't just a local disaster, it was a tragedy of epic proportions that had a profound impact on the entire nation. The storm ended Galveston's golden era as potential investors turned to nearby Houston, fearful of future hurricanes. In the wake of the storm, significant changes were made, including the construction of a seawall to protect the city and the raising of the island itself. This introduction sets the stage for a closer look at how this catastrophic event unfolded, starting with the formation of the storm and the initial signs that something was amiss. In the next part, we'll explore how the hurricane developed and the preparations, or lack thereof, that were made as the storm approached the Texas coast. The 1900 Galveston hurricane began its deadly journey as a tropical storm in the far eastern Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of West Africa in late August. At the time, meteorology was still a developing science, and the tools available to track and predict storms were rudimentary at best. Despite these limitations, weather observers noticed the formation of a storm system that appeared to be gaining strength as it moved westward across the warm waters of the Atlantic. By the end of the first week of September, the storm had intensified into a full-fledged hurricane, although its exact path remained uncertain. In those days, the United States Weather Bureau, which later became the National Weather Service, relied heavily on reports from ships at sea and limited land-based observations. Communication between different regions was slow, and information about the storm was often outdated by the time it reached the public. As the hurricane approached the Caribbean, it made its first significant landfall in Cuba on September 6th. The storm caused considerable damage but did not lead to widespread alarm in the United States. Unfortunately, the Cuban meteorologists' warnings about the storm's potential severity were largely dismissed by their American counterparts. The Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. predicted that the storm would veer northeastward and spare the Gulf Coast. They did not realize that the hurricane was about to take a more dangerous course. On September 7th, the storm entered the Gulf of Mexico, where it encountered ideal conditions for further intensification. The waters of the Gulf were exceptionally warm, providing the energy needed for the hurricane to strengthen rapidly. By now, it was clear that the storm was heading toward the Texas coast, but the residents of Galveston remained largely unaware of the impending danger. Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, had noticed some concerning signs. The Gulf waters were rising, the wind was picking up, and the barometric pressure was dropping, a clear indication that a powerful storm was approaching. However, like many others, Klein did not believe that a hurricane of great strength could strike Galveston. He assured the public that there was no cause for alarm, even as the signs of an approaching storm became more ominous. By the evening of September 7th, the weather in Galveston had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Heavy rain and strong winds battered the city, but most residents believed it was just another typical Gulf storm. Some even ventured out to the beaches to watch the waves crash against the shore, unaware that within hours those very waves would rise up and engulf their city. As night fell, the storm continued to intensify and the fate of Galveston was sealed. The lack of preparation and the underestimation of the storm's severity would prove to be catastrophic. In the next part, we will delve into the day of the hurricane, when the full force of the storm struck the city, bringing with it unimaginable destruction and loss of life. On the morning of September 8, 1900, the residents of Galveston awoke to a scene that was already foreboding. The winds had grown stronger overnight, whipping through the streets with increasing ferocity. The sky was a heavy, ominous gray, and the usually calm waters of the Gulf had transformed into a raging, turbulent mass. By mid-morning, the situation had become more alarming, as the winds reached hurricane force and the tide began to surge. Despite the growing danger, many in Galveston remained unaware of the severity of the storm that was about to engulf their city. Some, who lived in more vulnerable areas near the coast, had begun to move to higher ground, or to the homes of friends and family. Others, however, believed the storm would pass without significant incident, as so many storms had before. The lack of an official evacuation order or any clear warning only added to the sense of false security. By midday, the full force of the hurricane had arrived. The winds, now exceeding 100 miles per hour, tore through the city, ripping roofs off houses, toppling trees, and turning loose debris into deadly projectiles. The storm's surge, a massive wall of water pushed ashore by the power of the hurricane, began to inundate the island. Water levels rose rapidly, flooding streets, homes, and businesses. The low-lying areas of Galveston were quickly submerged, and the floodwaters continued to rise with alarming speed. The waves, driven by the relentless winds, battered the seawall-less island with incredible force. Entire neighborhoods were swept away as houses, unable to withstand the surge, collapsed and were carried off by the floodwaters. People who had sought refuge in their homes found themselves trapped by the rising water, with few options for escape. Panic set in as the reality of the situation became clear. This was not just a severe storm, it was a catastrophic hurricane unlike anything Galveston had ever experienced. As the day wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. The winds continued to strengthen, now reaching their peak at over 130 miles per hour. The storm's surge rose higher, swallowing more of the city and leaving only the tallest buildings and structures above water. Many sought refuge in the few large buildings that remained standing. But even these were not immune to the storm's wrath. The sounds of crashing waves, howling winds, and the destruction of buildings filled the air, creating a terrifying cacophony. The city's communication with the outside world had been cut off, leaving those in Galveston isolated and without any way to call for help. The Weather Bureau had no way of knowing the true extent of the disaster unfolding on the island, and the residents could only rely on their instincts to survive. Some attempted to flee to higher ground, while others clung to whatever they could find, hoping to ride out the storm. By nightfall, the hurricane's fury showed no signs of abating. The floodwaters continued to rise, and the winds, though beginning to taper slightly, were still devastating. The once vibrant city of Galveston was now a scene of utter devastation. Entire neighborhoods had been wiped out, and countless lives were in peril. The destruction was so widespread that it was difficult to comprehend the full scale of the disaster. As the storm finally began to move inland and lose strength, the people of Galveston were left to face the horrifying aftermath. In the next part, we will explore the aftermath of the hurricane, the devastating loss of life, and the heroic efforts of those who survived to help rebuild their shattered city. As the winds finally subsided and the floodwaters began to recede, the true extent of the devastation in Galveston became horrifyingly clear. The city, once a bustling hub of commerce and culture, now lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been obliterated, reduced to little more than piles of debris. The elegant mansions that lined the coast, the bustling downtown businesses, and the modest homes of working families were all gone, swallowed by the storm and the sea. Survivors emerged from their makeshift shelters to find a landscape that was almost unrecognizable. Streets were buried under mountains of wreckage, with shattered timbers, broken glass, and twisted metal strewn everywhere. The floodwaters, which had risen as much as 15 feet in some places, had left behind a thick layer of mud and silt, further complicating the already overwhelming task of recovery. The air was thick with the stench of salt water, mud, and decay, and the eerie silence that followed the storm was punctuated only by the sounds of people searching for loved ones and beginning the grim task of collecting the dead. The loss of life was staggering. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is widely believed that between 6,000 and 12,000 people perished in the hurricane, making it the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Bodies were found everywhere, trapped in the wreckage of their homes, washed up on the shore, or buried under debris. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed the city's ability to deal with them, and many were buried in mass graves or simply lost to the sea. The survivors, many of whom had lost everything, were left to grieve in the midst of unimaginable destruction. The city's infrastructure was in shambles. The water supply was contaminated by salt water and debris, making it unsafe to drink. The telegraph and telephone lines, which had once connected Galveston to the outside world, were down, leaving the city isolated and without a means to call for help. The railroad bridges that connected the island to the mainland had been destroyed, cutting off any possibility of bringing in supplies or evacuating the wounded and displaced. In the absence of any formal communication, rumors and fear spread quickly among the survivors, adding to the sense of chaos and despair. Despite the overwhelming devastation, the people of Galveston did not give up. In the days following the hurricane, a massive and heroic recovery effort began. Those who had survived the storm immediately set to work, clearing debris, searching for survivors, and caring for the wounded. Makeshift hospitals were established in the few buildings that remained standing, and volunteers worked tirelessly to provide food, water, and shelter to those who had lost everything. Word of the disaster slowly began to reach the mainland, and help soon arrived. Relief efforts were organized, and supplies began to trickle in by boat, the only means of access to the island. The U.S. Army was dispatched to assist with the recovery, and volunteers from across the country came to Galveston to help with the monumental task of rebuilding. The city's residents, though devastated by their losses, showed remarkable resilience and determination as they began to piece their lives back together. The rebuilding process was slow and fraught with challenges. With so much of the city destroyed, there was a shortage of materials and labor, and the work was often dangerous. Many of the buildings that had survived the storm were damaged beyond repair and had to be demolished, further adding to the sense of loss. But despite these difficulties, the people of Galveston pressed on, driven by a desire to rebuild their city and honor the memory of those who had been lost. In the final part, we will explore how Galveston rose from the ashes of this disaster, the lessons learned from the hurricane, and the lasting impact it had on the city and its people. In the aftermath of the hurricane, Galveston faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a city nearly wiped off the map. The task was daunting, but the people of Galveston were determined to restore their home. The process began with clearing the massive amounts of debris that littered the island. This was no small feat, as the storm had left behind mountains of rubble, tangled with remnants of homes, businesses, and lives that had been lost. Volunteers, military personnel, and the remaining residents worked tirelessly to clear the streets and begin the long process of reconstruction. Now, one of the most significant and ambitious projects undertaken was the razing of the entire city. Engineers proposed elevating Galveston to protect it from future storms, a project that was both unprecedented and monumental in scope. Buildings were jacked up, sometimes as much as 17 feet, and sand and dirt were pumped in to fill the space below, Streets were raised and a new seawall stretching more than 10 miles was constructed to shield the island from future storm surges. This engineering marvel not only transformed the landscape of Galveston, but also demonstrated the city's resilience and commitment to surviving in a perilous environment. The economic impact of the hurricane was profound. Before the storm, Galveston had been a major port and one of the wealthiest cities in Texas, known for its vibrant culture and booming economy. The hurricane, however, shifted that prosperity to nearby Houston, which emerged as the region's new economic powerhouse. Despite this shift, Galveston remained an important city, continuing to thrive in new ways. Tourism became a significant industry as visitors flocked to see the seawall and the city's ongoing recovery efforts. The storm also had a lasting impact on disaster preparedness and response. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane is often cited as a pivotal moment in the development of modern meteorology and emergency management. The scale of the disaster highlighted the need for better forecasting, communication, and evacuation planning. Lessons learned from Galveston influenced policies and procedures that would be implemented in future disasters, helping to save countless lives in the years to come. Galveston's recovery was not just about rebuilding structures, it was about healing a community that had been deeply scarred by tragedy. The loss of thousands of lives left a permanent mark on the city's collective memory, and the stories of those who perished became a part of Galveston's history. Memorials were erected and annual commemorations were held to honor the victims and to remind future generations of the city's resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Today, Galveston stands as a testament to the strength and determination of its people. The city has evolved, but it has never forgotten the lessons of the past. The seawall, the raised buildings, and the memorials are enduring symbols of the city's commitment to protecting its future while honoring its history. Galveston's story is one of survival, resilience, and rebirth, a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming disaster, a community can rise again, stronger and more determined than ever. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, but it also serves as a story of hope and recovery. Galveston's ability to rebuild and adapt has inspired countless others, proving that even the most devastating tragedies can lead to renewal and growth. The city's legacy continues to live on, not only in the physical structures that were rebuilt, but also in the spirit of its people, who faced one of nature's fiercest storms and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and resilience.